Great. Well, good morning and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Renee Lennon and I'm the Director of Marketing and Relationship Management here at Skyline. And I'll be your host for today. Get started with the introductions of our presenters. I would like to introduce our VP of Business Development, David Parsha, who would like to say a few words to get us kicked off today. David?
Thank you, Renee, and good morning to everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I just wanted to take a quick moment to talk about the spirit drivers behind today's webinar and subsequent events that we will conduct. We all face an unprecedented situation right now. COVID-19, the pandemic, it's having profound effects on all our families, our friends, and our communities. Right now, I don't think my story is unique. My wife and I are balancing, and we're balancing the time that we want to spend with our two young children. And we have the uncertainty more about our family and our friends and our community. But through that uncertainty, as we discussed at Skyline, what our approach and our mindset and our focus is, we look at this uncertainty as an opportunity for us to just focus on the values that we have here at Skyline. And first and foremost, for us, that's collaboration with our community, which includes our customers and our partners. When we think about today's webinar, it focuses on the aspects that we focus on as an organization, which is sharing perspectives, educating each other and learning from each other as we try to move through this unprecedented time. So what you'll hear from the webinar today is us sharing the perspectives that we have gleaned from talking to you and other customers and partners that we have out there as a way to learn together and as a way to educate each other through this time. Additionally to that, we recognize from a focus standpoint that while this adversity has a profound impact, we do see this as an opportunity through adversity to grow as people, personally but professionally. So the spirit of today and the intent of today is bring us together so that we can share perspectives, so that we continue to learn together and grow as people through this unprecedented situation. So thank you again for attending today. And I want to turn it back over to Renee to introduce our panelists. Thanks again.
Wonderful. Thank you, David, for your thoughts and perspectives. I think that really helps set the tone for today's webinar. And now I would like to introduce you to our presenters. First, we have Paul Lennon. Paul is our Chief Technology Officer here at Skyline. As CTO, Paul oversees our strategy and service delivery. He consults with our customers, helping them to develop their strategic direction and the associated technology innovation, as well as team development and operational process improvements. He's responsible for delivering driven solutions related to enterprise and service provider network services, physical plant management, IT security and assurance, and public and private cloud solutions. He has 25 years of experience providing consulting operations management and program management to DOTS, local and municipal government, and commercial clients. Next up, we have Matt Smith. Matt is Skyline's Chief Network Engineer with over 20 years in the field serving SLED, commercial, and service provider organizations. Matt achieved his Cisco CCIE certification in 2001, and he has maintained it actively over the past 18 years. Matt has the being employee number 2 here at Skyline and was a founding principal organization. Matt enjoys leveraging his skills and experience to help customers navigate the digital transformation challenges that their industries are facing. And now we have Ari Friedman. Ari is one of Skyline's top solution consultants with over 20 years of experience in the field of systems integration and solutions delivery for enterprise and SLED customers. Ari has extensive expertise in cloud and hybrid environments, as well as end-to-end systems management. Ari provides our customers with system support, secure network design, systems analysis and development, and full lifecycle project management. He brings an energy and understanding to all of his client interactions, helping them to solve even the most complex challenges. And last but not least, it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Schaefer. Chris is our Director of Innovation here at Skyline. He is an automation evangelist, a culture of DevOps and agile solutions development within Skyline and our client environments. Chris has a skilled background in supporting managed services and custom solutions development with a wide breadth of knowledge across the IT landscape. Chris tirelessly works with Skyline partners, to help Skyline achieve its mission in establishing deep relationships with customers through partnership in solving their most difficult and complex problems. And Chris was instrumental in helping Skyline achieve our SOC 2 attestation using the NIST framework. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul and Matt.
Thank you, Renee, and thank you for joining us today. On the agenda today, we have 5 talking areas. Part 1 is enabling your remote workforce. Part 2 is how does operations change for a remote workforce. This is specifically around operational centers like traffic operations centers or flight control centers. What is the IT management landscape shift as your workforce goes remote? What are some of the things you should be thinking about and considering? Next is ensuring that your remote workforce can continue to be as productive and as connected as they have been when they were in the office. Now that their user experience might change, what should you be considering and thinking about and ensuring that that stays as fluid as possible? And lastly is ensuring that as your workforce goes outside of your protective barrier of firewalls and internal corporate assets, how do you continue to sustain a cybersecurity posture that you have maintained internally to date? And something I want to bring everybody's attention to is if you could put any kind of questions you may have during the presentation, please put them in the chat channel, and we will try and address those time permitting towards the end of the conversation. So, what did the networks look for most organizations before COVID-19? Well, you had all your employee staff working inside of the organization by and large, whether they were traditional office knowledge workers, protected by your corporate protection assets, including firewalls and patching, malware, etc. Maybe data center applications, the data centers that you host yourself that have more of your core applications. And there's a portion here that for some of our customer base, for example, DOTs or industrial, they tend to have applications that are specific to a function that is an operational network. And they have operations personnel that either work in a traffic, like I said, a traffic management center that has access to all those assets. So those are kinds of users that exist in a lot of our customer space. So what happened? Well, now everybody's been told work remote, don't come into the office, stay socially distant. That is very different from what most organizations have experienced in the past. And what we're finding is most COOP plans or DR plans didn't really account for this kind of scenario. They account for things like, hey, let's reconstitute somewhere else, but people are back together. So what is it that you should be considering as you try and reconstitute your capabilities with an entirely remote workforce?
Hey, Paul, I just want to add one thing to that. I definitely noticed that all of the COOP and DR planning exercises that I've ever remember being part of, they're very much focused on specific facility-based events or regional-based events. So I think I want to just echo that what you said is that this experience that we're all having right now is one that I doubt very many people actually planned for. If you did, and you were one of the lucky ones, fantastic. But I think this is all hitting us, as Dave mentioned when we first started this, hitting across the board at all intersects of our customer base.
Thank you, Matt. So first area we're going to cover is kind of remote hardware. So what does that mean? Well, when most of your organization lived inside, you had folks like Bob, who has a laptop and maybe was already enabled to go home and bring his laptop home, and he's potentially up and running because you already have some level of remote access solution for the Bobs of the world. And for this, that's great. They already can use most of the tools. They already have a way to get back into your organization. What may not be great is you only assumed there was going to be 5% of the workforce was Bob, versus now it's 100% of your workforce. So you might have kind of constraints on your VPN termination solutions or your internet pipes may not be beforehand. You may not have been as mobile as you need to be now. Individual number 2 is Johnny. Johnny has a workstation. He has a desktop at the office. He doesn't have a corporately issued mobile device. So for the time being, you have to either figure out how do I get a new corporate device out to Johnny, or have them use their own personal platforms, their desktops, their iPads, their whatever technology they have at home, to continue to be able to provide the company's function. And this is a slightly different scenario because these assets are not assets that your organization has under operations and maintenance. So they introduce a kind of a different paradigm. If your organization already had a BYOD platform and solution in place, this may not be a big lift, but you have to think about how do I provide access to these users into my corporate assets so they can continue to be functioning. And if you're lucky to have already had some level of virtual desktop infrastructure, those individuals, again, see previous conversation about scale, capacity, and so forth, those individuals may be able to do some corporate assets and applications leveraging a level of VDI infrastructure that you have in place.
Hey, Paul, I just want to add in here. And I think that you're, the topic at hand, I think you're highlighting really well, because what we're focusing on is, yes, there may be a number of solutions that an organization may have in place that were put in place for a specific purpose. Like you mentioned, a BYOD policy to allow people to access their email from their personal device. And you have some method of managing that and ensuring that there's security around that. But it doesn't necessarily allow them to do everything they need to do. So I think a lot of the things we're going to be talking about is how do we enhance the solutions that are in place, or expand the solutions that are in place conceptually, to make sure that the remote workforce really can do all of the functions that they need to, using either things you already have implemented, or stopgap measures or additional enhancements to that to add the functionality that you're looking for.
Right. Thank you, Ari.
And on that too, Paul, sorry to interrupt, but I think the important word there that I've already mentioned that I don't think we emphasize enough is need, right? So a lot of times, as we mentioned earlier, I don't think anybody was lucky enough to plan for this level of an event. So really being able to prioritize need versus it'd be nice is really important for us as IT management services supporting our businesses to help them identify what are those critical apps. So I think need needs to be very highlighted there.
Yeah, I'm gonna echo that again, Matt. If organizations already develop DR plans, those DR plans tend to have things like what core services do they want to ensure are up first, second, et cetera. So thinking about what capabilities your organization needs and making sure those are available. You may not need every single application and function available, or you may want to prioritize how do you reconstitute and make those applications available. So any DR planning you've done in the past certainly will help in that aspect. So again, this is assuming the organization already has some level of VDI solution, or already has one that, similar to the previous example, that may have only been scaled to support, say, 10% of the kind of user community versus 90% of the user community now accessing that. So even this space right here, if you're even lucky enough to host, you may not have enough compute to actually handle the workloads that you have right now, which is where things like potential cloud providers, a virtual desktop, might be a solution that makes sense, even if you already have your own solution in place today. And these are relatively simple to turn up. The nice thing about these is they're as you use them. So you have an unusually high volume right now that you can envision that sometime in the future, we'll all be able to go back to the office. So I don't need all 10,000 of my employees to have virtual desktops hosted physically in my space, but I need to be able to scale to that in this period of strain. So a cloud, this is one of those things that naturally lends itself to kind of cloud delivered services. And it's something that requires very little physical deployment. So you can basically provision the workstations, the VDI workstations in the cloud, and establish some level of trusted network connectivity, whether it's a VPN, there's lots of different ways. I'm not going to get into the specifics, but basically establishing that connectivity. So again, you can start to publish the applications that are key to your workforce, whether it's Johnny Office or even the folks that have the full desktop potentially can connect into this space and start using those desktop applications as well.
One of the great things about that right now is that it's available, right? So the supply chain for the laptops is probably disrupted 1 to 4 months, depending on who you're talking to. So this is something that, Amazons and the Azures of the world, they have the priority for getting the hardware from the vendors, and they have the volume to protect their supply chain. So, they're furiously provisioning additional capacity to handle the load of people adding, virtual desktops and servers in the cloud to it. So it's a good way of getting around potentially not being able to get any hardware at all for a month or two for your staff.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chris.
And I just wanted to highlight one of the reasons why we're mentioning this specific solution, the virtual desktop option, is because of there are certain inherent risks with having people go home and just power on their personal machines and just get connected into your network, even if you did have a VPN solution and WAN services that would support that. So really, to avoid exposing your sensitive systems and your sensitive data to any potential device out there that does not have your arms wrapped around it from a security perspective, you really want that virtual desktop solution to provide it acts as a shim. So the end user connects using a controlled protocol into that environment, and none of the standard stuff is available. They can't access your domain controllers. They can't access your SQL servers. They can't access the file shares directly from their home machines. All they get is that screen experience where their mouse and their keyboard works. And then that virtual desktop, which is something that you manage very tightly and you control, that's what's allowed to access your network. It's part of your domain. You don't have to worry about authentication issues, and you're able to resolve a lot of that. To Chris's point, sorry, Paul, one more second. And to Chris's point, the deployment of that actually can be streamlined so that you can deliver it with all the apps that they need already installed on there. So you don't have to go through an exercise of every person at their house installing Office or installing some other application and figuring out how to deliver it to them and then supporting them when it doesn't work as expected or their version is incorrect. So it really does address a number of different specific issues when you're dealing with unmanaged endpoints.
Yeah, those are all excellent points, Ari. Thank you. So the next component is kind of ensuring basically only your employees have access. So we talked about how do you provide the access and how do you make sure there's enough hardware, but also how do you make sure that it's actually your employees? In most organizations, what you have is some level of identity management. And I don't know if Chris or Ari, would you guys want to walk through this? I can continue with it either way.
We can touch on it very briefly, and I think that the key point there is identity management is it's a very generic term that describes how a person's username, password, or their identity inside of your environment, your software, your network can be distributed to a number of different SaaS providers or a number of different applications. And again, because the term is so generic, sometimes it may seem to be overwhelming and say, yeah, that's going to take time to set up and it has to be very complex. But the truth of the matter is that most of the vendors that exist today to offer services like VDI or cloud services or SaaS applications, they have some very robust and easy to implement solutions that will connect to your existing Active Directory, and it will pull the information out of there over secure channels. It'll import it into their environment. It'll facilitate pass-through authentication into your piece. So I think that there's a lot there that we can obviously talk about. And it can turn into a much larger initiative for an organization. But for the purposes of getting your remote workers onboarded and working, it's actually something that needs to be considered, but it should not be a tremendously complex operation to get that enabled to facilitate that type of access.
Perfect. Thanks, Yuri. So with that, one is the identity, making sure that you have the credentials and things like username, password, and so forth. But one of the challenges with username password when you actually go outside of your firewall more explicitly is that if that information gets compromised by some of the bad guys that are out there, there's folks phishing your employees relentlessly, trying to get them to give up information or access or introduce malware into your environment. If a bad guy is able to get any one of your staff's just username password, they now have all the access they have, which is where something like a multi-factor authorization technology is incredibly important. What it does is basically provide, obviously the username and password is important, But couple that with some other asset, such as a text message to their phone or an application on their phone that basically they have to have a physical asset and the credentials. And there are lots of different flavors of this. Some organizations already have these technologies in place. See previous conversation about ensuring that now that your entire workforce goes mobile, make sure that that is enabled for the workforce. And similar to the virtual desktop environment, there are a wide range of SaaS, software as a service capabilities out there that you can leverage to basically enable that technology today.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, multi-factor authentication is kind of just table stakes for anything that's out there on the internet, right? Google found that when they went to hardware tokens, that they dropped internal breaches almost to zero. The process of doing that, and if you look at like the Verizon data breach report from 2019, that was a lack of multi-factor was featured in almost all of the attacks.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hey, Paul, I just want to point something out there. I think it goes back to what we alluded to earlier about looking at this situation that we're in as an opportunity, not necessarily a bad thing, although it is, but looking at it from an opportunity perspective, because this is the opportunity, as Chris mentioned, to be able to infuse some higher security practice or best practices into your organization, because right now you have to. We're going to expose a whole lot more to the internet than we ever have before. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be pulled out once we're done, right? These are things that best practices kind of dictate anyway. So it's an opportunity for IT to really show the value and the why, because everybody's going to start to expand or understand it.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I was going to say the same exact thing. That there's a lot of this investment that feels potentially as, oh, I've got to do this rush, but maybe I don't need to because it's only for a month or two. But a lot of these components are really important, even beyond this. So it's a great opportunity to understand why you should be doing this and how it actually plays on even post-corona. So application delivery. So what does that mean? So right now, most organizations either have data centers where they actually host their applications. They physically have been hosting their applications. So what happens if you can't get into your data center? So you have hard drive or server failure, and you're not actually allowed to get into that space to repair or reconstitute that service. That potentially could be a long-term thing. I know there's a lot of discussion about ending Easter, maybe it's several months, but what can you do potentially to protect yourself from that potential risk point? So one thing, some organizations have already gone partly down this path, is basically there are certain applications that just already are available via a software as a service. Things like Office 365 or Workday or G Suite, et cetera. These applications are core functions such as email or Office applications that are core to many organizations that they no longer need to actually host components. Are there other business functions that you have today that you are continuing to maintain your own iron and hardware to actually sustain it versus potentially moving towards a software as a service solution? And this might be a great catalyst for kind of moving forward on some of those initiatives. The other is just raw compute. Some things are just applications that are native to your organization. They run on your Windows servers, Linux servers, whatever they run on, and they have historically existed in your data center. But it may be a good time to consider, and there are lots of schools of thought. There's something called lift and shift, which basically means take your compute platforms and literally constitute them inside the cloud, like an AWS or an Azure. You're not leveraging the power of cloud, of a lot of the cloud automation, but you're leveraging the compute and the availability of the cloud, which given the current reality may be really important, which could be the beginning of a journey of transitioning yourself from maintaining lots of data centers that maybe are expensive to potentially start leveraging or dipping your toe a little more strongly into the cloud-based compute space.
Hey, Paul, I want to touch on one other potential factor. You mentioned the ability to get in and do repair or effectively maintain the servers that are already in place as one driving factor for this capability of pushing out to the cloud. I think another one is just the sheer communications requirements, right? If you remember, we talked about both Johnny and Bob used to be inside the organization. And for a lot of organizations, that may be single site or that might be multi-site, but the communications networks were designed to ensure that there was service capacity from the user's location into where those servers were housed. So a lot of times customers will, or different organizations will have those internal data centers housed in their HQ location, for example. And that might be co-located with the largest amount of their user base. My point in saying that is, as we talked about earlier, migrating those desktops out to the cloud, or wherever they end up being, a lot of times that high capacity communication infrastructure also needs to follow it. So by taking those important services and also pushing them out to the cloud, instead of leveraging that trusted connection that Paul shows right there, that is going to be limited bandwidth, because let's face it, most organizations don't have infinite internet capacity they can turn on in the drop of a hat, right? So being able to then lift and shift those or migrate those critical infrastructures out to where the desktops are now running, and use the cloud's backbone to enable that communication will definitely also, as we talked about earlier, enable higher performance for those users that are now displaced.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So kind of conceptually, before you have built this massive green internal network and enough capacity based on the usage patterns, and now you potentially have all your users coming in over your already choke point internet, which may be a problem, and or over a VDI environment that may have a choke point here. If you move those applications closer to where the quote unquote users are now, you're increasing their user experience and reducing the load on your environment.
And I think the key takeaway, just to reiterate, is while you're making these decisions, don't forget to include that poor network engineer is going to have to make all this happen. Not speaking as a network engineer, my side to, hey, don't leave us out, because we can definitely add value in those decision processes, and ensure that your infrastructure is ready to support those changes that you need in order to make the business function.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely, Matt. Chris or Ari, you guys have anything you want to say on this?
I think Matt touched on that. Really, it goes across the board, whether you're going to have lift and shift just so that they can be closer to the actual VDI infrastructure that you plan on standing up, or going to the SaaS model. There's a number of different cases where even if you do have a number of remote workers and you're set up successfully to have everyone with their VPNs connecting to some very sensitive applications that are inside the organization, at the current moment, the firewall or the internet bandwidth at the headquarters or at the data center, to Matt's point, may be oversaturated, and it may not be able to actually handle the hundreds or thousands of workers that are working remotely. So while under normal circumstances, this may not be the desired configuration, we may actually have to look at, well, how can we be a little bit more specific on how we utilize that firewall? How do we make sure that the traffic and the network comms that are leaving the client's workstation only go through that tunnel, only make it into my organization if they're supposed to access an application within there? And now that I have my SaaS-enabled applications or my cloud VDI, I can actually use the client's commodity internet. They're paying a Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, whoever they have their internet service with, and they can go directly there instead of hairpinning through your organization's WAN services and causing additional load and latency and performance issues. So that's another, that split tunneling idea is something else that should be considered when you're looking at how do I leverage the cloud and SaaS applications to give my users that better experience, instead of everyone just kind of getting that spinning. I gotta wait. Everything's just taking longer to load, and this is really not a good experience for me working from home.
Yeah. Thanks, Ari. I didn't have the pointer ready when you were talking, and I think you bring up a good point. I'm going to kind of re-echo this, because we've had a few customers that have already made this decision to do this, and we've helped them navigate that decision, which was this concept of what's called split tunneling. And just kind of vocabulary in case the audience is not familiar with it. Most organizations, when they have a fat VPN client, an actual VPN client on their mobile asset, all traffic comes back to corporate. And so it can get inspected on this firewall to figure out, hey, go into the corporate asset or go back out to Office 365. If you've already made the decision that you have several SaaS apps, you may want to change that profile. And this is where your CISO comes in and has to make a value judgment decision. But basically, say what's called split tunneling is saying things like, when I come to this point, if it's going out to a cloud provider, go directly over the internet. Don't consume my precious corporate internet pipe for those. And I'm accepting the risk as an organization that Office 365 is not going to introduce a new threat vector for me. but these are all decision points you want to do in concert between your network teams, your systems teams, and your cyber teams. But this is, again, all part of ensuring that you have as rich a user experience for your employees, as well as the cybersecurity posture that you need to maintain. So that's a really great point. Thanks, Ari. Okay, so that's on the application delivery side. Next, we are talking about protecting. So we've kind of hinted around this throughout, basically protecting your corporate assets as it goes outside. So really the big thing is, I kind of mentioned it earlier, most organizations kind of use this firewall as the ultimate protection point. And many CISOs say that that's obviously a very important component, but this isn't all security. All security is things like patching, is it AV? So, and understanding that this is not the entire security posture. And if you have a very heavy security posture that relied on this as being your security point, now that you've taken users from the green trusted space out into the unholy internet, you have a potential significant cyber reposturing that you have to consider. And the reason it matters is everybody, all the bad guys in the world are increasing exponentially. They basically know there's blood in the water. People are outside of their normal barriers and they're attacking like crazy. And they're phishing for your employees. They're trying to find entry points for your employees. Kind of an interesting statistic I read the other day is that 50% of the domain names that have the word coronavirus are malware. They're meant to distribute bad things to your staff. And this is unfortunate. Bad guys take advantage of bad situations. So understanding that that's the reality is important. And what do you and as organizational leaders need to do to ensure that your teams are set up for success? So one key component of this is, if you don't already have this in place, is making sure that you understand that everybody in your team, from the president to an administrator to whomever, has to be part of your overall security posture. One of the weakest links in your security posture is what your users understand about security and the actions they do or don't take. Are they susceptible to clicking on bad links? How do they understand what is their role in ensuring security? Now that everybody's outside, when you send communications, how do they know it's actually corporate sending them versus somebody acting like they're corporate? And have you established kind of communication channels to communicate as all your employees are gone from the office? Chris or Ari or Matt, do you guys want to add a little bit on that?
Chris has a lot to say on the matter.
Yeah, I think Paul, you did cover a lot of it. The threat intel we're seeing right now is it's just rampant. It's very targeted, very specific. That the attack types have changed. It's been a lot of kind of HR related phishing. A lot of whaling has kind of been the trend lately. Very targeted spear phishing campaigns. We've seen a pivot back towards just a very broad base of attack, impersonating the IT department almost always. There is still some HR phishing we're seeing where is HR sending information about COVID-19 updates and stuff like that. But the impersonation of IT had pretty much stopped, like from just a raw numbers standpoint. It was still happening, but it wasn't the primary kind of phishing campaign that we were seeing. But it's pivoted back to that now. So it's a good time to probably send some more communication, maybe run some specific training again, just to kind of harden that. And then making sure that you have things in place to mitigate it. Like, just assume, the whole assume breach mentality, right? Like, let's assume that the passwords are going to get compromised. That's where some of the other technology comes in, the multi-factor, kind of moving towards a zero trust architecture, understanding identity and devices. It makes it so that when the account gets compromised, it's not as big of a deal. And then just staying on top of, consuming a service that does some level of dark web monitoring and stuff like that. I hate saying the word, but it's a good thing to have, is people out there looking to see if your accounts are being sold on the internet, starting to get ahead of the breach, and then just putting robust security monitoring in place too, so that if it happens, and this is more, it's not a COVID-19 enabling remote work thing, but it's more sensitive now, is understanding the usage patterns and having things that look at the behavior, say when something's anomalous. One of my my favorite alerts that I have is that we get into SOC is geographically impossible logins, right? So it's like, you know, this user just logged in from Texas and Maryland simultaneously. You know, they had to travel over 1,000 miles an hour to make that login happen. Things like that we're seeing more false positives now because people are working remotely than we did in the past. And sometimes, you know, things hit different ways, but it's a good point of tuning. But we're also, that's a great way to catch these attacks.
Thank you, Chris. All right, Matt, do you guys want anything else on that?
Just real quick, I want to make sure that threat is extremely real. I mean, we just popped up these couple of news articles, but without getting into details, obviously we can't. I can attest that from an organizational perspective, Skyline's already been called in to help mitigate actual attacks that have already occurred. So if you walk away with anything from this particular section, and we don't want to do fear, uncertainty, and doubt and spread that, but due diligence is really going to be required as we go forward with this, because this is opening up all kinds of new threat vectors, and we need to take it seriously because they're already being leveraged and it's already happening. So just be careful.
I mean, I don't think it's created any new threat vectors. I think it's people are starting to double down on their efforts to attack the ones that already existed, right? And as we change how we deliver services, you know, there are maybe new surfaces for your company, but they're not new surfaces for the industry. So there are already best practices and bodies of knowledge about how to secure these technologies. And it's just important to understand what your compliance regulations are, what your risk is, and just understand, you know, where basically it's kind of understand what you need to do to secure your organization as you enable these technologies, but also understand that the risk of, you know, everything in security is a risk management decision, right? The risk of not enabling technologies to your business might be greater than the risk of these technologies being breached to enable them, right? Especially if you put some good practices around the management of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, to Paul's point earlier, I think what we're trying to hit on there is this, to your point, Chris, those threat vectors have already existed. But the key is we're starting to have to roll services out to customers and employees at a lot faster pace, most likely. And the hackers are going to take advantage of that communication gap where they are going to have to receive some emails that are asking them to do new things. That's what we want to make sure of is aware is that that's a new threat vector, maybe not new, but a more readily available threat vector that's occurring right now that the hackers are aware of.
Yeah, man, that brings up to kind of two conceptual points. One of them is, you know, people in general are just going to be a little bit more vulnerable right now because, you know, they're home, they don't have their coworkers there, they can't walk over to somebody's cube and ask them if they think that this is a good idea or is this real or do you think that, you know, we should be doing, you know, whatever it is, opening this email. So they're a little bit isolated, so they don't have that kind of peer review that they normally get just chit-chatting with guys in the office. And the other thing that it brings up is actually communications between the folks. So one of the things we haven't really touched on yet, but the method of communication and the modes of communication that people use when they're physically located in the same building is very different than when everyone's working from home. So that's another thing we want to make sure that we're considering is how are my teams going to talk to each other? How are they going to collaborate? How are they going to share, you know, XYZ type of info? And that plays into what Chris was getting at is what's my trusted communication solution? Is it just going to be a mass of emails constantly going out? Or is there going to be some other mechanism where I can use, you know, group chat deliveries, or I can use webinars, or I can use some sort of video, you know, interaction? There's a lot of different ways to enable that functionality. And there's a plethora of great solutions out there. There really is. It's really just making sure that we enable our users and they have the same way of communicating with their teams that they did before, and potentially in a better way. You know, there's a lot of more one-to-one communications I've been having with the folks that I don't usually see because they sit on the other end of the building or they sit in a different building, and now we're able to have that kind of face-to-face. And one of the other things that I think that part of this all comes together is the training of the users themselves. So you're bringing new tech to them, you're having them use their home computers, you're possibly changing a little bit of the workflow on how they actually get access to do their work. And there's a training consideration. You don't want them to feel overwhelmed. You don't want, I feel overwhelmed, you feel overwhelmed. And many times our end users are the most frustrated by the technology that we enable for them. We want to make sure we eliminate that while we're enabling them to do their work from home, because it just adds extra stress. As you can see by the guy, you know, with the lawnmower and the packages being delivered and the kids running around. It's just, you know, it's stressful enough without the technology itself causing you more grief. And the training also plays into how do we make sure that that the security pieces are in place. You know, so much of it is just user training and making sure that people are vigilant. So both of those go hand in hand, and the training aspect is really an important part of that.
And I want to take this to a second just to answer one of the questions we got, because we kind of touched on risk there briefly, and I think it's a good time to bring this question in. So, Peter, you know, I'm sorry to hear that your staff's been impacted directly, and I'm hoping that everyone recovers. It's something that we're hearing more and more of. You know, I think out there in Seattle, you're kind of a little bit ahead of us, unfortunately, on what's going to happen to the rest of the country. So, that being said, though, I think one of the ways to help mitigate the question, just to read it off, is several of our IT staff have been affected with COVID-19. What can we do to mitigate our IT risks, given that we have lost some of our SMEs? I think thinking about core and context is probably where I would start about that, which is like, what are the IT services that are absolutely core to you doing your business and that you need to keep in-house? And those are just the absolutely critical things. You know, whether it's your manufacturing floor, or it's stuff that's, you know, out in the lab, and it's, you know, it's has a bunch of regulations, and it's GMP, and it's really where your IP lives. And then context is just everything around that supports it. It's all this supporting IT functions. You have to have it to be a business, but the question is maybe, is this the time to look at moving some of those things to SaaS providers that are context? Is that the time to maybe look at augmenting your existing IT staff and having them do more management of vendors and less management of the actual infrastructure to enable them to really be able to put all their energy into your core differentiators? Does anyone else have any kind of thoughts on that?
I think, Chris, you bring up an interesting point. I mean, I guess it's going to sound funny coming from a consulting resource. Of course, we're going to say this, right? But truthfully, a lot of times these things that you're getting ready to need to deploy quickly are not skill sets that are readily inherent in most IT organizations, because in order to get those skills, you have to have already deployed it, and it's the catch-22, chicken before the egg issue, right? So being able to reach out to vendors or consultants such as our organization, or there's plenty of others, to be able to tap into those resources that have those experiences already, that can quickly enable your organization to roll these services out, augment your SMEs that are no longer available to you at the time that you need them. But to Chris's point, I think what's very critical is that those SMEs don't have the knowledge of your infrastructure and what's critical to your organization. So I think in Chris's example, if you were a pharmaceutical company or a manufacturing company, knowing that what a particular application that's going to be moved is going to affect. So if you're in the middle of a production run and the contracted resource comes in and doesn't know any better and says, well, hey, I can move this at midnight. Well, we didn't know that midnight is your production run. So I think coupling that in a very partnership manner and reaching out to those trusted vendors to help you deploy that is a really strategic choice right now. The only thing you lose out on traditionally is that on-the-job experience, so that you can live with it once you're done. But a good contractor will understand that and give you the OJT and follow-up capabilities, so that you can stop outsourcing when you're ready for it.
What's OJT, Matt?
On-the-job trading, sorry.
Another, I think, thing, the way to look at risk, right, is you basically have a couple options. You can accept it, mitigate it, or transfer it, right? So moving some of these things to SaaS providers is also just a risk transfer strategy, right? So it's letting you manage the risk that is core to your business and transferring some of that risk out to be managed. And Microsoft 365 is a great example. I was listening to a podcast that their lead security architect was on, and the amount of information, the amount of threat intel, they call them signals, that they're consuming is in like the billions per hour. So by moving some of these things to those big platforms, you're starting to leverage the kind of like the entire body of the internet in some ways to find those phishing emails, to prevent them from coming in and stuff like that. So there's some good strategies there where using some of these platforms enable us to actually reduce and transfer our risk.
Yeah. There's something.
Sorry, real quick. This, Peter, I know it was your direct question. I think it led into that particular location in our slide deck pretty well, so we went and answered it. But if we didn't answer it to your satisfaction, or anybody else has additional questions, please use the Q&A on the side to add additional questions.
Thank you. So Ari talked about this pretty extensively around how do you make sure that now that your workforces are remote, they're set up for success? Because we just talked about a lot of shifts, and there's potentially a lot of education. Some folks, I've never dialed in from home. I've never VPN'd in. I've never done a thing. There's a new desktop environment. Whatever those are, is ensuring that your organization has a means of educating the team that doesn't overwhelm your service desks. A lot of organizations have service desks that are underwater right now because everybody is calling in on how do I do fill in the blank. So there's an education strategy for your team to set them up for success that is really important, especially as you start potentially moving some of these building blocks or enabling things that folks have never been aware of. And the other point that Ari made really well is how do you continue to have the level of high touch and connection between your teams that used to be able to just walk down the hall when they're remote? Do you have the right level of collaboration and kind of connection tools that you need within your teams, and equally important with your customers, as their world has also changed? So making sure that it's not just technology, but it's actually enabling connection and continuing the business. So that's really key to success.
Hey, Paul, can I add one thing on that? And I think it's interesting to note that typically our current Bob-like customers that were already mobile were kind of our higher end, whether they're the IT personnel or the executives, where we're used to giving them high touch, dedicated help desk staff, for example, to get them set up or go to their houses. Those solutions, while they work for a small group, are not going to be sustainable for solutions when we go out to the entire employee organization. So ensuring that we're empathetic, because a lot of the problems that we see from an IT organization's perspective is we develop these incredibly good solutions, and all we think about is it from our own perspective. Well, this will be easy enough. I know how to VPN in. It's simple. You click this, put my token in, wait for it to call my phone, and then say yes or whatever the solution is. It's easy for us, but not necessarily easy for a person who's never experienced that remote work. So I think one level of empathy and really asking yourself when you come up with these solutions, is this something that's easy for someone who doesn't know IT to be able to implement in their home, is a good aspect to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that last part is really important, as you're probably finding a lot of folks doing home IT support for their spouse or whatever. And that is a challenge. Everybody in the workforce has a different level of IT sophistication and understanding and appreciating that and being patient with each other as this kind of pretty significant transition is occurring. All right. And so this last slide, this is not necessarily kind of kind of a push for any particular vendor or platform, but it's important to know that there's really a lot of providers in this space, and they provide across all five of these areas. Some of them in specific areas, some of them across. So just understanding the platforms that are available, and again, many organizations already have pieces and parts of many of these components. It's really thinking about, do you have the ability to scale up and down as this has shifted? And are there other things that maybe make sense to move forward with that you may not have considered in the past? And anybody else on the panel want to share something on that?
When I look at this list of vendors, it obviously is all the big names in the industry, and I think that what we've seen in response to this immediate need that many of the organizations have, most of the organizations have, is that at least from my perspective, the vendors really have risen to the challenge, and they're offering many different opportunities for customers or new potential customers to engage with them at little to no cost and be able to explore their services. It allows your IT staff to really get a good handle on what solution is going to work best for you. And one of the things we came across is that the benefit to having such a diverse marketplace is that there's not necessarily going to be one vendor or one solution that works for all of your use cases. And the important piece here is this is all about getting those workers who, just like when you're in the office, you use a number of different types of applications to get the work done. You may have a number of different types of solutions. and being able to take this opportunity and explore those and utilize them to the greatest advantage for your employees, for your workers, to get the specific tasks done that are most critical to keeping the operations running, keeping the business running. I really think that it's very available, and therefore it should be taken advantage of in order to make that happen. One of the things we didn't really quick, one of the things we didn't touch on was the delivering those applications, right? So we talked about education a little bit, and we talked about the importance of the different types of delivery methods and connectivity methods and everything else. I'm looking at the list here, I'm reminded that many of these vendors actually have kind of an onboarding solution where you get you provide the user with either a web link or some other very minimal task to accomplish, like clicking a link and enter some information, or I can remotely push something to your device, or you have to get some sort of. But once it's there, then you can actually enable the entire onboarding of the device, the deployment of applications, the configuration of the security parameters, and there's a lot that can happen that streamlines that process to reduce the load that the service desk is going to have. As Paul pointed out, they're already inundated. They're already trying to deal with the overload of support requests and really getting people back online, and finding different ways to educate the users and enable them from a technology standpoint is going to be important. So those are some other things that we would want to make sure we explore to enable that to happen.
Just maybe share some anecdote here. So, we're here giving the webinar on how to enable our remote workforce, and frankly, the vast majority of our workforce was ready to go. Our core IT staff was and their consultants and engineers. They've been set up to work from home for a really long time now, even though we were primarily in the office. But what wasn't set up to work from home was our service desk. So our NOC was in SOC was very much in the building. These guys are working their shift work, they're in the building. So, and they have, a lot of time they were spending, needing that close collaboration and needing the visibility of the video walls that were being provided and stuff like that. So transitioning them to home required us to kind of look at how we were going to do it the same way that everyone else is right now. And we ran into the same problem that a lot of people ran into with laptops. These guys, they weren't using laptops, they were using workstations in the operations center. So they didn't have hardware to take home. We had some laptops, so we were able to give some people laptops, but it was like, hey, how do we deliver these services quickly enough to be relevant and securely enough to meet our customer and our SOC 2 obligations and all the controls we're holding ourselves to, while not being able to buy hardware, right? So we personally leveraged Amazon Web Services. We used the Workspaces VDI environment, and just a matter of honestly probably about 2 or 3 days, we had it stood up, an image built for the NOC, so they were getting their own things. They were authenticated. They were being multi-factor authenticated by Okta. We were doing some level of host posture checking on the devices to make sure that their home machines that they were now using had the up-to-date Windows patches, just, as moderately good I'm not super worried about it, but it's just good practice to do that. And then and through that VDI environment, we're delivering their soft phones to be part of the queue, to be able to take calls. We're delivering all of the specialized applications they need to manage Sienna equipment and Juniper equipment, all the stuff that they need to do to manage and machine and web services.
And bringing up your point earlier about the supply chain issue, it may not be possible for us, or for the nation at large or the world at large, to be able to get all the equipment that they need in such a short notice. It's expensive, it's time consuming, and there may be some delays. But there's also alternative options. Once you go to an Amazon workspace or some sort of Microsoft remote desktop or virtual desktop, a Citrix solution, there's the hardware endpoints that can be delivered to a user where it can use multiple monitors, keyboards, mice, and it can connect over the internet securely to this delivery service that's providing the remote desktop at I'm going to say minimal cost. Again, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but a very reasonable cost, and it may be a lot easier for users because they don't have to deal with a whole nother laptop or a whole nother piece of software taking up all that time and space. It's just a little thing that they can plug in, and it just sort of works. It auto provisions, and everyone's really happy. So yeah, there's a lot of options out there for getting those users enabled as quickly as possible, using stuff that they already have because we can't get them new stuff, or we don't want to buy new stuff.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. There's something you mentioned earlier, Ari, which I think many of these providers and others are offering a lot of flexibility to their customers and potentially new customers, flexibility on licensing. So as we started at the beginning, we talked about maybe say 10% of an organization potentially was remote at one point. So you had kind of 10% licensing available. There's certainly a reach out and understand based on the platforms you might even have today already in place. You might have a lot of flexibility from your vendor community to kind of give you the scaling, even if you don't have, and again, this is a lot of variables there, but it's important characteristic to understand. Also, it makes it easy to adopt new technologies right now to see if there really is value to you. So just understanding that there's a lot of energy being spent in the industry on trying to help kind of dampen the impact of kind of the entire world going to remote or socially disconnected and distant.
Hey, Paul, if you don't mind, I want to add on something. I think in Chris's expose on some of the work we've been doing internally, it's important to note because I don't think we covered it in our topics per se. But telecommunications is also an aspect that I think we need to address, right? So for those of you, I mean, you can imagine Skyline has a NOC and a SOC and a call center. And to date, as Chris mentioned, we typically kept those call center staff in a single geographic location with DR, et cetera. But those phones also had to move, right? So one of the things we did test, and I was actually surprised at how well it functioned, is soft phones added on those virtual desktops. And being able to make calls from that remote site using a headset with whatever platform that customer had to their access, and being able to share that headset, USB attached headset through the VDI, I thought was amazing integration. So for all you people or all those customers that are out there that might be suffering from that same kind of mindset of, well, I'd like to be able to move my staff out of where they're at, but they're tied to this handset. There are definitely options, and we can help you explore those if needed, to take even traditional PBXs that are fixed line and make those IP enabled to be able to integrate with remote workers and telestaff as well. So just bear that in mind.
And this, as technologists right now, this is our kind of chance to really provide just a lot of business value, right? That it's kind of always been IT staff. I think IT over the last couple of years, some people have been looking at more as hey, it's a cost center. Like, what do we need to do to just kind of manage and just provide the core business functions through IT? But this is a chance for technologists to really step up and create true business value and enable businesses to continue functioning in this crisis. And that's kind of an interesting place to be. And I think we need to look at it through that lens of that's an opportunity for us to potentially fundamentally change the way the world works at some point. Like teleworking I felt like it was kind of a fad for a little bit, and then like everyone did it, and then it kind of went like, well, let's go back to the office maybe. But I've been a full-time teleworker from 2005 to 2015. So I've kind of seen the gamut, and going back to telework pretty heavily in the last couple weeks here, it's crazy how much it's changed. I think it's time to revisit it some. I think Ari said it earlier. Some of the collaboration I feel like is even better remote than it was in the office now, because you're interacting with people differently, and it's just a kind of a different experience than when you are geographically dispersed, but not everyone is. So sometimes people get forgotten because they're in a different building or whatever. And just to kind of maybe touch on it, one of the other questions was what do some of these technology vendors do? And I'm just going to kind of point out some of the ones that I think are neat for this. And they all play a crucial role, but it's things that we don't necessarily think of them being able to do. And Aruba is one of the ones that actually pops out there. With their APs have the ability to VPN home, right? So you can actually just deploy a Aruba AP out there. That's not an everyone solution, but that's your CEO's solution. I think is kind of interesting, right? You want to just his devices on the network the same way they are at the office, like ship them in Aruba, have them plug it in, it comes up, it phones home. I think that's pretty neat. Carbon Black or even some of the other EDR solutions, right? That's giving us the ability to do that same kind of forensics in cybersecurity incident response remotely. We used to have to bring PCs into the office and plug them into an X-Ways dongle and do all sorts of crazy imaging and all that stuff. The ability for your SOC to very quickly say, yep, something popped, let's go see what it is, and log in there, see what's running, dump memory, start conducting that investigation. That's technology that's really probably just matured in the last 2 years or so, compared to the traditional endpoint technology. I think we've already hit on some of the other ones. I don't know if anyone else wants to call out some of the unique functionality of some of those other vendors there.
So I think, Chris, I like the kind of the Aruba example you mentioned. I think that example, so when we were talking about client VPN, that mostly refers to some software running on a laptop that they log in and they credential in and get back to corporate. But it's quite conceivable and relatively easy. There's a lot of folks that already have small office, home office platforms, leveraging technologies like SD-WAN, and not to spend too much time on this, but you can do basically zero-touch provisioning. Literally ship the piece of hardware from the factory to that employee's home office. They plug in, it quote unquote calls home and self-provisions their connectivity. So from an end user, it's simple. I just plug in and it's just like the office. So this is back to just understanding the pain that your teams are in, and kind of what are some of the building blocks you may be able to deploy to ease their experience as they're going through this transition. There's another part, Chris, that you kind of talked on a little bit, which I know you and I had I'll call it a quasi-spiritual dialogue around this, which is kind of what, as technologists, what can we do in this time of crisis? I don't have healthcare experience, so I can't go in the hospitals and be a frontline helper. So I can't provide any help there. We see this as kind of, this is a really important thing that a lot of organizations are struggling with. And we really are just trying to figure out what is it that we can do? Where is our focus in this time of crisis? And how can we really help folks? And that sounds maybe a little sappy, but it's genuine. We understand, as kind of Matt talked about, this may not be core skill sets that organizations have. They never thought to build to this scale. So like, how can we help organizations as they're struggling through the realities that they're struggling with today? So I don't know if there are any other kind of questions or any other topics that we want to cover today. I guess I'll throw that out to the panel. I'm unable to look at. I'm having my remote challenges right now. I can't actually look at the Q&A.
Paul, I'd like to take one. I think Aaron copied. Let's see, which one was it? Basically, I don't have an existing integration with cloud provider. What can I do if I want to use the VDI solution that you mentioned, or application delivery services? I think one of the things that I didn't include on this particular slide is another vendor set to help you in this is also your service providers, right? So if you consider a CenturyLink, AT&T, Verizon, you name the service provider du jour, each of them, just about all of them that I'm aware of, also have cloud integration capabilities where they can take your existing MPLS-based WAN services that are tying some of your remote sites together and automatically for you integrate that with a cloud service provider. So it looks like that cloud service is almost directly connected to your WAN without you having to actually buy a circuit. It's a service, it's pay for service, but without having to actually go install something. So a lot of times bring them into the loop early.
Did we lose you, Matt?
No, I'm still here. I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of talk, just to bring up for folks, you're talking about this connection. That's why I kind of glossed over it significantly, but that's what you're referring to here. It's like, how do you get from the cloud back to corporate? And kind of a macro options is one is VPN tunnels, but the other part is as I think you're talking about, you might have carriers like this green cloud right now for your corporation might be an MPLS infrastructure by Verizon, AT&T, whichever carrier. And a lot of them already can tie that in. You can just basically provision a circuit into your MPLS network. So there's lots of ways of building this without physically going out and deploying anything.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the key to that is there's several options, as you mentioned, IPsec tunnels, direct integration with carrier that can be explored. And it's not a one size fits all, and it's not even like you might go immediately with an IPsec tunnel solution over the internet and then migrate yourself into a carrier-based direct connect solution as well. as you are able to get your carrier to support you. So I just wanted to make sure we touched on that because there are definitely are ways to integrate. So don't feel like just because you've never set it up before that it can't be set up relatively quickly to support you.
Thanks, Matt. And another question, Ari, Chris, if you guys can take this one, is question around multi-factor authentication. Help me understand what additional factor possibilities are in current situation beyond username and password I already maintain in my Active Directory services. Chris or Ari, you guys want to take that?
Sure, I'll take a quick stab at that. So the concept of multi-factor authentication, I think it really, and I think Chris might have highlighted this earlier in the conversation. When you talk about authentication and really ensuring before you fully authenticate someone and decide, and the organization decides they trust them from a connectivity perspective, you really want to validate the person is who they say they are, and usually the most effective way to do that is by using their username and password, and then using something else aside from their username and password. And that usually falls under the categories of something you have, or something, or what's the categories, Chris? Remind me. Something you are, something you have, and something there's a little.
You know, something you are, something you have.
Yeah. So and that's usually the methods that we use to use that multi-factor, right? That secondary mechanism. It could be 2 or 3, but in today's world, the most common one is a text message. And granted, from an absolute security perspective, there are many security folks who will tell you there's lots of inherent problems with text messages.
Hate it.
But it's 1,000% better than not having multi-factor at all. So
completely agree.
Yeah, you're right. You don't let that stop you just because it's not the most secure method. Chris mentioned also that Google, was it Microsoft? Google recently transitioned Google to the hardware keys, and that is actually something these days that's becoming a heck of a lot easier to deploy. They're not expensive. You don't need the entire smart card infrastructure. There's a number of different techs that allow you to get these keys, provision them. The users can do it. They can do a self-provisioning. They kind of plug it into the laptop, and unless they're plugged into a USB port, you don't get access to the apps. There's also, the applications that you can install on your phone, the Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, depending on the single sign-on solution that you're using. It may have its own application. I know Okta has one, and Secure has one, and some of the other, Duo has their own. So each one can kind of build their own app that may or may not work on a desktop or a mobile device. To allow you to kind of get that push notification that says, hey, was this you? Did you really sign in? And I say, yeah, I did. And then it goes from there. There are other methods as well. There's face recognition and fingerprint recognition. And there's, some of the more inclusive solutions will include, hey, we'll send you an email with a PIN code instead of, that way, again, in and of itself, that presents some circular problems if you're trying to get into your email and your only method is, authenticating by an email. But nevertheless, many of these are going to be more effective than not having anything, because it requires someone who's now compromised your device to do some extra work. And for most, and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, most of it for them is a game of numbers. How many compromises can we get, and how do we best utilize the ones we can get our hands on without going through and individually targeting people? Go ahead.
I think individual targeting, it definitely happens. It's not the primary focus, right? If you're being individually targeted, your industry's being individually targeted, like you probably already have things in place to help handle that, because you're like, yep, nope, I'm on the Made in China plan, the Made in China 2020 plan. So like my industry needs, we're probably already focusing on this. It is just a numbers game, right? The whole goal is to get credentials, establish footholds, prioritize what footholds we want to exploit, and then, I was assuming the same management methodologies we use to manage the workforces, Kanban or sprints or whatever. They're sitting there doing the same thing, where they got the list of 30 targets they're going to hit this week, and then they're going to hit them, and then they're going to move on to the next group. So just putting speed bumps in the road, honestly, does a lot to completely stop these attacks.
Yeah. There's the running joke of if you and your buddy are out running a bear, take your time to put on your sneakers. You just have to outrun your buddy, not the bear. and that's effectively what this is about. It just makes it a little harder, so it's not worth the squeeze, unless your organization is worth the squeeze. And that's back to the targeted versus blast out attacks. So I think that's kind of really important to kind of understand.
That's one of the prime examples. Like that ties directly back to this conversation we were having about SMS, right? So if I target an organization using SMS, like I can go buy on eBay, I can go buy stingers and stingrays, and I can put them out there, and I can sit there and I can find the user, and I can wait for I can generate an authentication request with my stolen credential to see his code pop on the the unencrypted text message. I can do all this, but like, yeah, it's a real attack, but the level of effort required to execute it, or I can call the phone company and get the SIM card cloned and put it in my phone. I can do all sorts of craziness, but it requires it's a technically easy attack, but it requires a level of dedication that is atypical, right? It's not what most attackers are going to engage in unless you're being specifically targeted.
Yeah.
So you start talking about the risk, likelihood, impact, probability, all of that stuff kind of comes together, right? It's potentially a high impact, and it's a technically easy attack to carry off, but it's probably pretty low likelihood.
So another question that's kind of related, because this all sounded very complicated, is kind of the question of all of this sounds very complicated. Like what is kind of required? How do you? I'll read it. It sounds it's possible to get all this in place for my workers. All this sounds incredibly hard and requires a lot of planning. And the answer to that is yes and no. I think Matt elaborated it really well when he said, I don't want to sound like a vendor or a consultant right now, but there's a reason that most organizations don't have the skill sets to develop something like this very expeditiously. So there's a part that you want to consider, like how do I do some of this, and how do I engage external organizations to help me with this, coupled with how much of the entire existing organizations has to be remotely available. So there's a lot of things to consider. Something as simple as making sure people can see their email. That might be enough for your organization. We don't know. And that's part of like when you go through and understand what are your core applications and how do you deliver that? And then how do you enable some of this stuff? Chris mentioned the example of us in 3 days virtualizing our security operations center, network operations center using Amazon workspaces. I'm not saying it was an easy exercise, but the concept was pretty easy. Yeah, this is an important function. We need to make sure that it is remotely available. We've made a decision to prioritize a solution around it. And that same level of kind of care, once you know what you want to do, what is important, I think anything is relatively possible, even in short order. It's just understanding the journey to get there. I don't know if anybody else has kind of comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting comment about that, right? Is we have continuity of operations plans, we have DR plans, right? They didn't encompass global pandemic as one of the scenarios. In fact, normally if I see something like global pandemic in a DR or COOP plan or a DR tabletop exercise, I'm like, okay, let's stop being ridiculous. Let's pick something more realistic. Like a backhoe cut the fiber to the building, not no one can work anywhere near each other, right? It's just it was a black swan, in retrospect, maybe it was more predictable than we thought it would be. There's certainly been enough signs, Bill Gates' TED Talk in 2015 basically said this was going to happen to us, right? But I don't think anyone was really planning for it. But having the ability to understand that this was not a planned for event and just rallying to solutions and just quickly prioritizing those business essential functions, mission essential functions, whatever you want to call them, and just solutioning them first to ensure the continuity. I mean, that's got to be the focus right now. Is identify the services that you can't live without, and get them working remotely.
And something else to add to that, I'll say we went through this relatively quickly and we covered many topics. These are all potential building blocks. It doesn't mean that an organization needs to do all of these things to become virtual. There are elements that could be brought to bear to enable your business to continue operating remotely. And not all these things would have to be deployed or implemented. It's really a part of the journey is understanding what tools are available to you as you face this challenge. And how do you prioritize the implementation of those new capabilities and tools to make sure that you can continue to do what is core to your organization? Not necessarily everything, but just what is important.
I want to re-echo what Matt was touching on very, very, very quickly. He mentioned that number one, we're here to help. Obviously, one of the reasons why we're putting this together is because we see the need out there, and we think that we have some guidance that we can offer if anyone is interested in talking to us about any of these specific topics. And secondly, kind of what Chris and Matt were talking about as well. There are a number of different versions of this that could be implemented over time, and this is just conceptually how things could look or could work. And maybe tomorrow there's going to be a new piece of tech or a new application, and that's going to be what we're going to be looking forward to in the next 15 years or 5 years or 1 year. But in order to get the users online, there may be what we're going to do today, and then what you need to do in a month from now, or in a year from now. When Matt was talking about the connectivity, hey, we got to get connectivity from the remote cloud into our environment. Great, let's get an IPsec tunnel stood up immediately, and then we'll worry about the backhaul. We'll worry about some other sort of integration that is a little bit more, efficient and costs a little bit less, or uses some other pathways. So there's a lot of different, and with all of the solutions, that's kind of what it looks like. When Chris was talking about standing up Amazon workspaces, yeah, you can spend months planning what those workspaces look like before you even begin deployment, or you can just get them deployed, get the apps delivered. And while it may be a little, I'm going to use the word clunky, or a little bit not perfect, don't let perfection stand in the way of actual success. And that's really what the key here is there's no, you're always going to be shooting for perfect. And there's always more that can be done when integrating with different solutions. But as has been echoed many times, focus on what's important and find the solutions that work for the immediate short term while still planning for what's going to be in the future.
Perfect's the enemy of good enough. And right now the world needs solutions that are just good enough to keep things moving. That I think this is also a point where if we deliver these services well, these are likely going to become just permanent things. These, if you spend the energy in doing it now, you're going to spend the next couple months refining things and finding little niggly problems that don't really affect the good enough, but affect the perfect. But after this is done, our security network operations center, right? This capability is going to be a capability that they have going forward. That's going to change how it's going to work when we need to do, snowstorms, when we have other events that happen that previously we managed different ways, hey, here are the cots, here's your food, guys. Now it's okay, cool. These guys they have the ability to do stuff that was functionality that just wasn't there before.
Chris, to that point, I thought it was kind of interesting. I saw a couple articles come across my desk regards to K through 12 educational customers. Looking at this going, well, we got to put all this out for these remote classrooms, and whether they're using Google Classroom, et cetera. And they're like, well, why can't we just do this when there's no events? I know kids aren't going to want to hear that, but it's going to significantly change.
You've just ruined snow days for every single child.
Yeah, I know. But luckily, I doubt there's children probably in the background of all of us, right?
For me, it's just my dog. I think the dogs are behind this whole thing, actually.
So one other question that kind of was brought up that I'm going to read right now. We mentioned that quote unquote bad guys know what's going on and are looking for ways to leverage the situation to take their advantage. Can we elaborate on potential ways I can help safeguard my employees and help them know communications are official and which ones are not? And that's a great question and a tough one. Ideally, organizations already have been have had communications that are trusted and known within the employee staff, whether it's communications from HR, communications from leadership, etc. So there's definitely a need to ensure that they understand, hey, setting up this is how we're going to communicate. This is this email chain or this website or this collaboration tool is the way we are as an organization going to communicate updates, etc. And the secondary part to that, which if you don't already have it in place, is really a cyber education program. I mean, we mentioned a product like Know before. It's too much to try and do right now, but it's certainly the right time to potentially start to making sure that your employees understand that that's even a risk, that there are people that are masquerading as quote unquote corporate communications. Just even communicating, be aware that this exists, is an important communication.
Yeah, cool. And on that, I think Chris mentioned don't let perfect get in the way of the good. Right now, it's kind of empirical that we get people who aren't used to being at home looking for those attack surfaces. So even things such as changing the email banner that you use for the signatures and just saying, hey, we mark this as COVID-19 or whatever the keyword's going to be, just so that they have a visual cue when they see official emails come from the company that this isn't official, because the odds, like I mentioned earlier, about somebody doing a targeted attack right now are probably lower. So just even little things like that maybe aren't, Chris is probably shaking his head at me right now, but maybe aren't perfect, but are still better than nothing, right?
Yep. And I think like something as simple as, and Matt just got to hit it. If you don't already have any email coming from outside your company, being obviously marked as this email came from outside of the company, that's a very simple protection. Just that your users will go, oh, I've never seen this before, or they're already used to that. That's a very simple kind of communication, making sure that you're reducing the probability of somebody from the outside masquerading as you. Chris, are you want to add anything to that?
No, I was actually in my mind, I was trying to think of what do you do if you're an organization and you don't have any of those pieces in place, you don't have the banners, you don't have any predefined, code words. What do you do? And I'm thinking the easiest way to solve this is with a phone tree, right? I know it's old school, but you just get a kind of top down, everyone calls their, subordinates or their coworkers or whatever it is and communicates the method or communicates whatever the information is, at least in some very, very basic form, because there is that need to kind of distribute something that says, here's how the company's going to do something, right? When you see this, it's going to be from our guys, and you don't, then it's something at least to be concerned about or to be aware of. And again, it sounds a little out there, but I think that when you're trying to think of what we really didn't have any solution for this in place, what do you do? Right. Without sending out an email saying, trust me, I'm sending you an email that you should only trust me. Like, that's the worst thing you could do.
And there are some capabilities available in Outlook, right, to send encrypted messages or messages that are marked as tagged, and leveraging the public key infrastructure that's in place natively to some of these applications to verify the authenticity of the message. So there's some technical solutions available.
Right, and that actually is the opposite end of the scale. Is if you already have a number of protections in place, but you do have some concerns, you do the SMIME encrypted mail, and you do some authenticated pieces there. There's a lot you can do to enhance communications from a security perspective, in addition to just getting off the ground and getting some of the basic pieces in place.
Thank you, Ari. And I know we're getting close to time. I think I'm going to go ahead and Renee, do you have any comments you want to make?
Hi, Paul. I think you guys did a great job. To our clients out there, we hope that you found our webinar informative. If you have additional questions, or if you want to engage our team to help you with your specific remote workforce plan, please reach out to your relationship manager or your business developer, or I think Paul put up on the screen there, other channels that you can use to connect with us. And as the whole team said, we are here to help you in any way we can. So please leverage us. And I think that concludes our webinar for today. Please stay safe. And we hope that you have a great remainder to your week.